The night draped itself over Los Angeles like a velvet curtain, heavy and unrelenting, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and sharpened senses. Interstate 405 stretched endlessly before James Carter, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the sprawl of Southern California. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m., its green digits a quiet reminder of how long the day had been. James, 35, African American, and head of the Internal Affairs Division for the Los Angeles Police Department, gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Audi, the hum of its engine a low, steady pulse beneath his thoughts. He was bone-tired not just from the 16-hour day he'd just endured, but from the weight of his work, the kind that forced him to stare into the cracks of a system he'd sworn to serve. James wasn't just any cop. He was the man who policed the police, the one who dug through complaints of misconduct, sifted through lies and half-truths, and held officers accountable when they crossed the line. It was a job that earned him respect in some circles and resentment in others. To some, he was a guardian of justice. To others, a traitor in a blue uniform. Tonight, though, all he wanted was to get home to his modest apartment in Culver City, pour a glass of bourbon, and let the world fade away. The city had other plans. The freeway was quieter than usual, the late hour thinning the usual snarl of LA traffic to a scattering of headlights. Palm trees loomed like silent sentinels along the median, their fronds swaying in the faint breeze. The air carried the faint tang of exhaust and eucalyptus, a scent as much a part of Los Angeles as its dreams and disappointments. James's radio was off, replaced by the low hum of his own thoughts. He'd spent the day reviewing a case involving an officer accused of planting evidence in a gang-related arrest, a messy, high-stakes investigation that had left him with a headache and a lingering sense of unease. The evidence was damning, but the officers' union was already circling, ready to defend their own. It was the kind of fight James lived for, not because he enjoyed it but because he believed in it. Justice wasn't a buzzword to him, it was a fire in his bones. His reverie broke as red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror, sharp and insistent, like a predator's eyes in the dark. James's pulse quickened, not out of fear but instinct, honed by years of navigating a world that too often saw him as a threat before it saw him as a man. He hadn't been speeding, his speedometer hovered at a steady 65 miles per hour, right at the limit. No broken taillights, no erratic driving, no reason for a stop. Yet the patrol car clung to his bumper, its siren silent but its lights screaming authority. James's jaw tightened. He knew this dance too well. He signaled, smooth and deliberate, and eased onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under his tires. The patrol car followed, parking at an angle that boxed him in, a subtle power play. James took a deep breath, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, visible, non-threatening. He'd been here before, not as head of internal affairs, but as a black man in America, pulled over for reasons that often had nothing to do with the law. Each time he'd walked away unscathed but not unchanged. Every encounter left a mark, a reminder of the tightrope he walked between his identity and his badge. The officer emerged from the cruiser, his silhouette stark against the glare of headlights. He was wiry, mid-40s, with a crew cut and a stride that oozed confidence. His flashlight beam cut through the night, pinning James to his seat like a spotlight on a stage. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice sharp with a mix of routine and disdain. He stood close to the window, his badge glinting under the freeway's sodium lights. The name tag read Daniels. Officer Daniels. James noted it, filing it away like he did every detail in his line of work. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Daniels asked, though it wasn't a question, it was a challenge, laced with the kind of authority that expected compliance. His eyes, pale and unyielding, scanned James with a scrutiny that felt personal, as if he were looking for something to pin on him. James kept his voice even, his words measured. "No, officer. I'd like to know the reason." His tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it, a quiet refusal to be cowed. He met Daniels's gaze, unblinking, his dark eyes steady despite the flashlight's glare. The officer didn't answer right away, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't bother hiding its prejudice. The beam of his flashlight swept over the interior of the car, lingering on James's tailored charcoal suit, the leather briefcase in the back seat, the faint glint of his watch. To Daniels, these weren't signs of a man who'd earned his place, they were anomalies. red flags in a narrative he'd already written. "You don't look like you belong out here," Daniels said, his voice low, almost a drawl. "What's a guy like you doing in a place like this?" The words landed like a slap, deliberate and loaded. The place was the stretch of freeway skirting Brentwood, a neighborhood of manicured lawns, gated estates, and unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. James felt the familiar sting of being profiled, the assumption that his presence here was suspicious, out of place. It wasn't new, but it never got easier. He leaned back slightly, his hands still visible, his breathing steady. "I'm driving home, officer," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Same as anyone else on this road." The simplicity of the statement was a challenge in itself, a refusal to let Daniels's insinuations take root. But the officer wasn't backing down. He stepped closer, his flashlight now angling directly into James's eyes, a petty attempt to assert dominance. "Step out of the vehicle," Daniels ordered, his voice hardening. "I need to search it. For safety." His hand rested on his holster, fingers twitching just enough to make the threat clear. The word safety was a flimsy pretext, and they both knew it. There was no probable cause, no traffic violation, no justification beyond the officer's own biases. The air crackled with tension, the kind that could ignite with a single wrong move. The freeway stretched empty behind them, its silence amplifying the stakes. A lone semi-truck rumbled past, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene before plunging it back into shadow. James's mind raced, not with fear but with calculation. He'd seen this playbook before, officers using vague claims of safety to justify overreach, banking on intimidation to force compliance. But James wasn't the type to fold. He'd spent his career dismantling that kind of abuse, case by case, complaint by complaint. As head of internal affairs, he'd faced down cops with more clout than Daniels, men who thought their badge made them untouchable. He knew the law, knew his rights, and knew the power of staying calm when everything around him screamed for escalation. "Officer," James said, his voice steady as granite, "you need a warrant or probable cause to search my vehicle. I haven't violated any traffic laws, and you haven't articulated a reason for this stop. So let's keep this by the book." The words were a line in the sand, polite but unyielding. Daniels's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he processed the pushback. Most people would have complied by now, cowed by the badge or the threat of arrest. But James wasn't most people. Daniels leaned closer, his flashlight unwavering, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think you can talk your way out of this? I'm doing my job, and you're making it harder than it needs to be." His hand stayed on his holster, a silent reminder of the power he wielded or thought he did. The night seemed to close in around them, the distant city lights a faint promise of civilization that felt worlds away. James's phone sat on the dashboard, its camera lens glinting faintly, though Daniels hadn't noticed it yet. The red dot blinked steadily, capturing every word, every gesture, a silent ally in a confrontation that was only beginning. James's heart beat steady, his mind clear. He'd been in tougher spots than this, courtrooms where union lawyers tore into his investigations, precincts where officers stared him down like he was the enemy. But this was different. This was personal, a test of everything he'd built himself to be. He wasn't just a cop, not just a black man, not just a man with a badge. He was James Carter, and he'd spent his life proving he belonged here on this freeway, in this city, in this fight. And he wasn't about to let Officer Daniels take that from him. The officer stepped back, his flashlight still trained on James's face, but his posture shifted, a flicker of uncertainty creeping in. "Last chance," Daniels said, his voice tight. "Step out, or I'm taking you in for obstruction." The threat hung heavy, a dare to escalate, to turn this routine stop into something uglier. James didn't flinch. He knew the law, knew the risks, and knew the truth. This wasn't about safety. It was about power, and Daniels was about to learn who he was dealing with. The night pressed in around James Carter, the air thick with the kind of tension that could spark a fire with a single wrong word. Interstate 405 was a silent witness, its asphalt stretching into the darkness, indifferent to the drama unfolding on its shoulder. Inside his black Audi, James sat motionless, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, visible under the harsh glare of Officer Daniels's flashlight. The officer's command to step out of the car hung in the air like a guillotine, sharp and heavy with intent. "Step out of the vehicle," Daniels had said, his voice a mix of authority and menace, his hand resting on his holster in a way that screamed power. But James wasn't intimidated. He'd faced worse than this: courtrooms where union lawyers tore into his investigations, precincts where officers glared at him like he was the enemy. This wasn't new. It was just another chapter in a story he'd been living his whole life. "Officer," James said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "I'm going to need you to articulate the probable cause for this stop and search. You haven't provided one." Each word was deliberate, a quiet assertion of his rights, delivered with the calm precision of a man who knew the law better than most cops on the beat. His dark eyes locked onto Daniels's, unyielding despite the flashlight's glare. He wasn't just refusing to comply, he was drawing a line in the sand, one that said, "You don't get to treat me like this without a fight." Daniels scoffed, his smirk twisting into something uglier, more personal. "You getting smart with me?" he snapped, leaning closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. "I said step out now." His hand tightened on his holster, fingers twitching just enough to make the threat clear. The freeway's distant rumble faded, leaving only the pulse of this moment: two men, one with a badge, the other with a truth too heavy to ignore. The sodium lights overhead cast long shadows, turning Daniels's silhouette into something almost predatory. James exhaled slowly, his mind racing through a mental checklist honed by years of training and experience. He wasn't just any civilian. As head of the Internal Affairs Division for the Los Angeles Police Department, he'd spent a decade dissecting the missteps of officers like Daniels' men, who thought their badge gave them a free pass to bend the law to their will. He knew the playbook: vague claims of safety concerns, fishing expeditions disguised as routine stops, the subtle intimidation meant to force compliance. But James wasn't the type to fold. He'd built his career on standing firm, on holding the line when others backed down. With a subtle movement, he tapped the record button on his phone, discreetly angled on the dashboard. The red dot blinked to life, a silent ally capturing every word, every gesture. He'd learned early in his career to always have a record. Too many complaints to Internal Affairs had been dismissed for lack of evidence. Too many truths buried under he said, she said. Tonight there would be no ambiguity. The camera was his insurance, his proof, his weapon. "I'm not stepping out without a valid reason," James said, his tone unwavering, each word a brick in the wall he was building between himself and Daniels's overreach. "You need a warrant or probable cause to search my vehicle. That's the Fourth Amendment, Officer Daniels." The use of the officer's name was deliberate, a reminder that James wasn't just a face in the crowd. He'd read the name tag under the flashlight's glare, filed it away like he did every detail in his investigations. Daniels's eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Most people would have crumbled by now, cowed by the badge or the threat of arrest. But James's calm was a kind of defiance, one that rattled the officer more than any shout could have. "You think you're a lawyer or something?" Daniels spat, his voice rising, betraying a crack in his confidence. He stepped closer, his flashlight now angling directly into James's eyes, a petty attempt to assert dominance. "I don't need your permission to do my job. This is about my safety. You could have anything in that car, drugs, weapons, you name it." The accusation was flimsy, a fishing expedition wrapped in the thin veneer of protocol. James could almost hear the gears turning in Daniels's head, searching for a justification to escalate, to turn this stop into something he could control. James tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, but confident, the kind of smile that said he'd seen this game before and wasn't playing. "Safety," he repeated, the word dripping with quiet irony. "If this is about safety, then let's keep it professional. I'm driving home same as anyone else. No traffic violations, no suspicious behavior. So what's the real reason we're here, officer?" The question was a blade, sharp and precise, cutting through Daniels's bravado. The officer's smirk faltered, his flashlight wavering slightly as he processed the pushback. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and electric. James's mind flashed back to a memory from his early days as a rookie cop, 20 years old, fresh out of the academy. He'd been pulled over on a street not unlike this one, in a beat-up Honda Civic he'd saved for months to buy. The officer back then had used the same playbook: vague accusations, a hand on the holster, the unspoken assumption that James didn't belong. He'd been too young, too green to push back then, and the humiliation had burned deep, a scar that never fully healed. But it had also lit a fire in him, a resolve to rise above, to become the kind of man who could face down that kind of injustice and win. Now at 35, with a decade of internal affairs investigations behind him, James was no longer that kid. He was a force, and Daniels was about to find out just how much. "I'm James Carter," he said, his voice low and steady, each word landing like a stone. "Head of Internal Affairs for the LAPD. You might want to rethink your approach before this goes any further." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Daniels froze, his flashlight dipping slightly as the color drained from his face. Internal Affairs, the words were a specter in every cop's mind. The department that could end careers, strip badges, and expose truths better left buried. James didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His authority wasn't in volume but in the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Daniels took a step back, his confidence unraveling like a cheap suit. "You're bluffing," he muttered, but the crack in his voice betrayed his doubt. His eyes darted to his cruiser, as if hoping backup would materialize to tilt the scales back in his favor. But the freeway remained empty, the night silent except for the faint hum of a distant car. James leaned forward just enough, his gaze piercing through the darkness. "You want to test that theory, officer? Or do you want to explain why you're stopping a man with no record, no violation, and no reason to be treated like a criminal?" The question was a trap, and Daniels knew it. His hand twitched on his holster, a reflex born of frustration, but he didn't draw. Not yet. James's calm was a weapon, disarming in its steadiness, forcing Daniels to confront the reality of who he was dealing with. The officer's eyes flicked to the briefcase in the back seat, the suit jacket draped neatly over the passenger seat, the polished interior of the Audi details that didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed. James could almost see the wheels turning in Daniels's mind, recalculating, searching for a way to regain control. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Daniels said, his voice tight, almost a growl. "Just step out, let me do my job, and we can both go home." It was a plea disguised as a command, a last-ditch effort to salvage his authority. But James wasn't budging. He'd spent too many years fighting battles like this on the streets, in boardrooms, in the quiet moments when he looked in the mirror and reminded himself why he kept going. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been pulled over for no reason, every voice silenced by a badge, every truth buried under the weight of power. "I'm not making anything harder," James said, his voice steady as a metronome. "You're the one who pulled me over without cause. You're the one escalating this. So let's be clear. I'm not stepping out, and you're not searching my car without a warrant. If you want to take this further, go ahead. Call it in. Get your supervisor. But know this, I'm not the one who's going to regret how this ends." The words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding. Daniels's face twisted, a mix of anger and uncertainty, his flashlight now a feeble prop in a performance he was losing. He stepped back, his boots crunching on the gravel, his hand still hovering near his holster but no longer gripping it. The night seemed to hold its breath. The distant city lights a faint reminder of a world beyond this confrontation. James's phone continued to record, its red dot a silent witness to the truth unfolding. Daniels might have the badge, the gun, the cruiser, but James had something stronger. The law, the truth, and a resolve forged in a lifetime of proving he belonged. The officer's radio crackled to life, a garbled voice cutting through the silence, but Daniels ignored it. His eyes were locked on James, searching for a weakness, a crack in the armor. He wouldn't find one. James Carter wasn't just a man in a car on a lonely freeway. He was a reckoning, and this moment was only the beginning. The air on Interstate 405 crackled with a tension so thick it seemed to hum. A live wire stretched taut between James Carter and Officer Daniels. The night was no longer just a backdrop. It was a stage, and the confrontation unfolding on the freeway's shoulder was about to draw a crowd. James sat in his black Audi, his hands still visible on the steering wheel, his phone recording every word, every gesture, its red at a silent sentinel. Officer Daniels stood just outside the driver's window, his flashlight wavering, his bravado fraying at the edges after James's revelation. I'm James Carter, head of internal affairs. The words had landed like a sledgehammer, cracking the officer's confidence, but instead of backing down, Daniels doubled down, his pride refusing to yield. You're not getting out of this that easy, Daniels growled, his voice tight with a mix of defiance and desperation. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching as if itching for a reason to escalate. I don't care who you say you are. Step out of the car, or I'm calling this in as obstruction. His eyes darted to his cruiser, where the radio crackled faintly, a lifeline to the authority he clung to. But James didn't flinch. His calm was a weapon, a shield forged in years of facing down men like Daniels, men who thought a badge made them untouchable. Call it in, James said, his voice steady as granite, each word a deliberate challenge. Get your supervisor out here. Let's see how this plays out when the paperwork starts. His gaze never wavered, piercing through the flashlight's glare, locking onto Daniels's pale eyes. The officer's smirk twitched, a flicker of doubt betraying his attempt to hold the upper hand. He wasn't used to this, someone who knew the law, who pushed back, who refused to be cowed by the weight of his authority. The freeway stretched empty around them, but the silence was deceptive. The night was about to get loud. Daniels stepped back, his boots crunching on the gravel, and reached for his radio. Unit 17, I need backup at mile marker 42 on the 405, he said, his voice clipped, trying to regain control. Possible non-compliant suspect. The words were a calculated jab, framing James as the problem, but James caught the faint tremor in Daniels's tone. The officer was rattled, and the call for backup was as much about saving face as it was about procedure. James leaned back slightly in his seat, his hand still visible, his mind racing through the possibilities. Backup meant more officers, more variables, more chances for this to spiral. But it also meant more witnesses, more eyes on a truth he was determined to expose. The distant wail of sirens cut through the night, growing louder as two patrol cars screeched onto the shoulder, their red and blue lights painting the scene in strobing chaos. Four officers emerged, their boots heavy on the asphalt, their faces a mix of curiosity and readiness. One, a stocky man with a buzz cut, approached Daniels, his voice low but audible. What's the situation, Mike? He asked, glancing at James's Audi with a frown. Daniels gestured toward the car, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial mutter. Guy's refusing to comply. Says he's some big shot with internal affairs. I don't buy it. James's lips curved into a faint, unyielding smile. He could hear every word, and he let them hang in the air, unaddressed for now. The new officers fanned out, one standing near the rear of the Audi, another circling to the passenger side, their hands resting on their belts, close to their weapons. The scene felt like a standoff, a tableau of power and defiance frozen under the freeway's sodium lights. James knew how this looked. One black man in a suit, alone in his car, surrounded by 5 white officers on a deserted stretch of highway. The optics were damning and not in his favor. But James wasn't playing for optics. He was playing for the truth. The night took a turn when headlights flashed from the opposite direction. A pickup truck slowed, then pulled onto the shoulder, its driver a middle-aged Latino man in a flannel shirt stepping out with his phone raised, the camera already recording. Yo, what's going on here? He called, his voice carrying a mix of concern and defiance. Daniels spun around, his flashlight swinging toward the newcomer. This is police business. Get back in your truck, he barked, but the man didn't budge. I'm just watching, he said, his phone steady. This don't look right. Within minutes, more vehicles pulled over, a beat-up sedan, a shiny SUV, a motorcycle with a rider in a leather jacket. A small crowd formed, 7 or 8 people, their phones out, their cameras rolling. The glow of screens lit up the night, a constellation of lenses capturing every move. James felt a shift, a subtle tilt in the balance of power. This wasn't just him against Daniels anymore. It was him and the truth, amplified by the eyes of strangers who'd seen enough to know something was wrong. Daniels's face tightened, his eyes darting between James and the growing crowd. Stay back, he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. This is a lawful stop. But the crowd wasn't listening. A young woman in a hoodie, her phone live streaming to X, stepped closer, narrating in a rapid, urgent tone. We're on the 405, and this cop's got a guy pulled over for no reason. Look at this 5 officers, 1 dude in a suit. This is some bullshit. Her words echoed across the platform, the hashtag Justice for James already trending as viewers shared the stream, their comments flooding in. Racial profiling again. When does this stop? This cop's done. James seized the moment, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Officer Daniels, he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. I'm still waiting for that probable cause. You've got 5 officers here now, and not one of you has given me a reason for this stop. Care to explain? The question was a spotlight, exposing Daniels's flimsy pretext to the crowd, to the cameras, to the world watching through their screens. The officer's jaw clenched, his flashlight dipping as he struggled to respond. The backup officers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the situation slipping out of control. Then James played his trump card. Daniels, he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a verdict. I approved a complaint against you last year. Excessive force, Compton, June 2023. Ring a bell. The words hit like a shockwave. The crowd gasped, a murmur rippling through them. The woman live streaming zoomed in, her voice rising with excitement. Did you hear that? This cop's got a history. Daniels's face went ashen, his flashlight dropping to his side as if it weighed 100 pounds. The other officers froze, their hands no longer on their belts, their confidence unraveling. The Compton case had been a ugly, only young black man, barely 19, roughed up during a traffic stop, his arm broken, his face bloodied. James had reviewed the body cam footage, the witness statements, the medical reports. Daniels had walked away with a reprimand, thanks to union pressure, but the complaint was on his record, a stain he couldn't erase. And now, here was James Carter, the man who'd signed off on that complaint, sitting in front of him, turning his own history into a weapon. The crowd grew bolder, their voices rising. A man in a baseball cap shouted, "Why you hassling him, huh? What did he do?" Another, a woman with a toddler asleep in her car nearby, called out, "This is why nobody trusts you guys." The phones kept recording, the live stream spreading like wildfire. X posts exploded with clips of the confrontation, each one tagged with Justice for James and LAPD exposed. The internet was merciless, dissecting Daniels's every move, his every word. Comments poured in. This cop's done for. Internal affairs guy? Oh, he's screwed. Daniels's backup officers began to waver. The stocky one who'd first approached him muttered, "Mike, maybe we should call this improper." But Daniels wasn't listening. His eyes were wild now, his composure shattered. "You think you can pull that card on me?" He snapped at James, his voice shaking. "You think you're untouchable because you're IA? I know guys like you. You're not as clean as you think." It was a desperate swing, a last-ditch effort to regain control, but it fell flat. The crowd jeered, their phones capturing every second of his unraveling. Then a new sound pierced the night, the shrill whine of a news van's tires as it pulled onto the shoulder. A local reporter from KTLA, a wiry woman with a microphone and a cameraman in tow, jumped out, already narrating. "We're live on Interstate 405, where a tense confrontation is unfolding between a motorist and LAPD officers," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. The camera's light swung toward James's car, illuminating his calm, resolute expression. The motorist claims to be an internal affairs official, and the officer leading the stop has a history of misconduct. Stay with us as this develops. The arrival of the news van was a game-changer. Daniels's face twisted in panic, his authority crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. The crowd swelled, now a dozen strong, their phones a chorus of clicks and beeps. A college student in a UCLA sweatshirt posted a clip to Instagram captioned, "This is what systemic racism looks like." It racked up thousands of likes in minutes. Another bystander, a middle-aged black woman with a voice like thunder, shouted, "You can't hide anymore. We see you." The words echoed, a rallying cry that sent a shiver down James's spine, not fear, but pride. These strangers, these ordinary people were standing with him, amplifying his fight. James leaned forward, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. "Officer Daniels, you've got a crowd, cameras, and a news crew watching. You've got no probable cause, no warrant, and a history that's about to catch up with you. So what's it gonna be? You gonna do this right? Or you gonna keep digging that hole?" The words were a gauntlet, thrown down in front of everyone. The crowd roared, their voices a wave of support. The reporter edged closer, her microphone picking up James's words, broadcasting them live to thousands of viewers across Los Angeles. Daniel's hand shook, his flashlight now useless, its beam flickering across the asphalt. The backup officers stepped back, their body language shifting from aggression to uncertainty. The stocky officer spoke into his radio, his voice low, urgent. "We need a supervisor out here now." The crowd cheered, sensing the tide turning. James's phone kept recording. Its read at a steady reminder that the truth was on his side. The night was no longer just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. And the world was watching. The night on Interstate 405 had transformed from a quiet standoff into a public spectacle, the kind that could ignite a city. Red and blue lights pulsed against the asphalt, casting eerie shadows across James Carter's black Audi, where he sat calm and resolute, his hands still visible on the steering wheel. His phone, discreetly recording, glowed with a steady red, capturing every second of the confrontation that had spiraled far beyond Officer Daniel's control. The officer stood frozen, his flashlight dangling uselessly at his side, his face a mask of panic as the weight of the moment crushed his authority. The crowd, now nearly 20 strong, formed a semicircle around the scene, their phones raised like torches, live streaming to X, Instagram, and beyond. The KTLA News van's camera bathed the freeway shoulder in a harsh white glare, its reporter narrating breathlessly to a growing audience. This was no longer just a traffic stop. It was a reckoning, and the world was watching. Daniel's bravado had crumbled, his earlier swagger replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. His backup officers, 4 in total, stood awkwardly, their hands no longer on their belts, their eyes darting between James, Daniels, and the crowd. The stocky officer who'd first questioned Daniels, Officer Ramirez, according to his name tag, muttered something into his radio, his voice low and urgent. "Supervisors en route," he said, glancing at Daniels with a look that bordered on pity. The other officers shifted uneasily, sensing the tide turning against their colleague. The crowd's voices grew louder, a chorus of indignation and support. "Let him go," a woman shouted, her phone steady as she recorded. "You got no reason to hold him." A man in a baseball cap added, "This is why we don't trust y'all." The words stung, but Daniels had no response. His authority was unraveling thread by thread, under the scrutiny of cameras and strangers. James seized the moment, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. "Officer Daniels," he said, loud enough for the crowd and the news camera to hear, "you've had plenty of time to explain this stop. No probable cause, no warrant, and now a crowd of witnesses. What's your move?" His tone was calm but commanding, a prosecutor laying out an airtight case. The crowd roared in approval, their phones capturing every word, every gesture. The woman in the hoodie, still live streaming to X, zoomed in on Daniel's face, her voice rising with excitement. "He's done, y'all. This cop's got nothing." Her stream had already racked up thousands of views, the hashtag Justice for James trending nationwide, amplified by retweets and shares from activists, influencers, and everyday people fed up with stories like this. The reporter from KTLA, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Nguyen, edged closer, her microphone thrust toward Daniels. "Officer, can you confirm the reason for this stop?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. "The motorist claims to be an internal affairs official, and he's referenced a prior complaint against you. Care to comment?" The question was a dagger, and Daniels flinched as if struck. His mouth opened then closed, his eyes darting to the crowd, the cameras, the other officers. This is a routine stop," he stammered, his voice thin and unconvincing. "Just doing my job." The crowd jeered, their voices a wave of disbelief. "Routine my ass," a man shouted, his phone raised high. The reporter pressed further, undeterred. "Can you confirm the motorist's claim about your record? Excessive force in Compton, 2023. Daniel's face went pale, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering onto the asphalt. The sound was sharp, final, like the crack of a gavel. The crowd erupted, their cheers laced with outrage. James watched, his expression unyielding but not triumphant. This wasn't about gloating, it was about truth. He'd spent years in internal affairs, sifting through complaints, watching body cam footage, piecing together stories of abuse that too often went unpunished. The Compton case had been one of many, but it stuck with him. A young man, barely out of high school, beaten and humiliated for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Daniels had walked away with a slap on the wrist, but James had made sure the complaint stayed on his record. A shadow that would follow him. And now that shadow had caught up. "Officer Daniels," James said, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "I asked for your badge number and your supervisor's contact information. I'm still waiting." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his words. The reporter's camera swiveled to capture James's face. His calm resolve a stark contrast to Daniels's unraveling composure. The officer fumbled for words, his hands shaking as he reached for his radio, only to hesitate. Ramirez, the stocky officer, stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Mike, give him the badge number. Let's do this right." It was a plea, a lifeline, but Daniels wasn't ready to take it. "This isn't over," he snapped, his voice cracking. "You don't get to pull rank on me, IA or not." The crowd booed, their voices a rising tide. A young black man in a Lakers jersey stepped forward, his phone still recording. "You're done, man. You can't talk your way out of this." The woman with the toddler, who'd been watching from her car, joined in, her voice thick with emotion. "You think you can just do this to people? We're not invisible anymore." Her words hit James like a jolt, not because they surprised him, but because they echoed his own resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her, for the kid in Compton, for every person who'd ever been made to feel less than human by a badge. The news van's camera kept rolling, broadcasting live to thousands across Los Angeles. Lisa Nguyen's voice cut through the noise, her tone urgent but professional. "We're witnessing a dramatic confrontation on the 405, where a motorist identified as James Carter, head of LAPD Internal Affairs, is challenging an officer's authority in a stop that appears to lack probable cause. Social media is exploding with support for Carter, and questions about systemic issues within the LAPD are resurfacing." Her words were a spark, igniting conversations across X, where posts with "Justice for James" and LAPD exposed racked up millions of views. Clips of Daniels's stammering responses went viral, dissected by commentators and activists alike. One tweet from a prominent civil rights lawyer read, "This is what accountability looks like. James Carter is exposing the rot in real time." The crowd grew bolder, their voices a chorus of defiance. A college student in a UCLA sweatshirt, who'd been posting to Instagram, shouted, "We're not going anywhere. You can't hide this." Her post had already been shared by a local influencer with 1 million followers, amplifying the story to a national audience. The man in the pickup truck, the first to stop, stepped closer, his phone still raised. "I've been stopped like this too," he said, his voice thick with anger. "Same bullshit, different night. We're done letting this slide." His words resonated, drawing nods and murmurs from the crowd. This wasn't just about James and Anna Marie, it was about all of them. A collective stand against a system that too often failed them. James felt the shift, the moment when the balance of power tipped irrevocably in his favor. He leaned forward, his voice steady but resonant, addressing not just Daniels but the crowd, the cameras, the world. "This isn't about me," he said, his words carrying the weight of a vow. "This is about accountability. No one, not me, not you, not Anionius, above the law." The crowd erupted in cheers, their phones flashing as they recorded his words. The reporter's cameraman zoomed in, capturing the fire in James's eyes. The quiet strength that made him more than a man in a carrot made him a symbol. Daniels's shoulders slumped, his authority reduced to a hollow shell. He turned to Ramirez, his voice barely audible. "Get the supervisor here. Now." But the words were too late, the damage done. The crowd's energy was electric, their voices a relentless drumbeat of justice. The woman in the hoodie, still live streaming, narrated with a grin. "Y'all, this cop's done. He thought he could bully this guy, but he picked the wrong one." Her stream hit 50,000 viewers, the comments flooding with emojis of fists and flames. On X, a local activist group posted a clip of James's speech, captioned, "This is how we fight back. James Carter is a hero." The supervisor's cruiser arrived, its sirens cutting through the noise. A tall, gray-haired woman in her 50s stepped out, her face etched with fatigue and concern. Sergeant Linda Hayes, according to her name tag, surveyed the scene. James in his car, Daniels trembling, the crowd buzzing, the news camera rolling. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp but controlled. Ramirez stepped forward, his tone subdued. "It's a traffic stop, Sarge. But it's complicated." He glanced at James, then at Daniels, who avoided his gaze. Hayes approached James's window, her demeanor professional but cautious. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Hayes. Can you tell me your side of this?" Her tone was neutral, but her eyes flicked to the crowd, the cameras, the news van. She knew this was no ordinary stop. James met her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I'm James Carter, head of internal affairs. Officer Daniels pulled me over without probable cause, demanded to search my vehicle without a warrant, and has a history of misconduct I personally reviewed. I've got it all recorded." He gestured subtly to his phone, the red dot still blinking. Hayes's expression tightened, her eyes narrowing as she turned to Daniels. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice low but cutting. Daniels stammered, his words tripping over themselves. I thought he was suspicious. It's a high-crime area, Sarge." The excuse was flimsy, and the crowd didn't let it slide. "High-crime area?" the woman with the toddler shouted. "This is the 405, not a gang zone." The crowd laughed, their scorn palpable. Hayes raised a hand for silence, her face unreadable. "Badge number Daniels," she said. "Now." Daniels fumbled, reciting his number in a voice barely above a whisper. James repeated it aloud, committing it to memory, his tone deliberate, ensuring the cameras caught every syllable. The crowd cheered again, their voices a tidal wave. The reporter, Lee Sing-Gwin, spoke into her microphone, her voice steady but urgent. "We're witnessing a historic moment on the 405, where a motorist's stand against an unjust stop is exposing deeper issues within the LAPD. Stay tuned as we follow this developing story." The power had shifted irrevocably. Daniels stood alone, his flashlight forgotten on the ground, his authority stripped bare by the crowd, the cameras, and James's unyielding resolve. The other officers stepped back, their faces a mix of shame and relief, as if distancing themselves from Daniels's fall. Hayes radioed for additional support, not to escalate, but to manage the crowd, which was growing by the minute. Cars slowed on the freeway, drivers craning their necks to see the commotion. The night was alive with voices, with truth, with the kind of energy that could change a city. James sat back, his hand still on the wheel, his heart steady. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't asked for it, but he was ready. He'd spent his life preparing for moments like this, moments when the truth could no longer be ignored. The crowd's cheers, the camera's lights, the reporters' questions, they were all part of something bigger. Something that reached beyond this stretch of freeway. This was about justice, about accountability, about a system that had to answer for its failures. And James Carter was at the center of it, not as a victim but as a force. The morning after the confrontation on Interstate 405 dawned bright and unforgiving, the California sun casting long shadows over a city buzzing with the aftershocks of James Carter's stand. The viral videos, clips of Officer Daniels's faltering excuses, James's calm defiance, and the crowd's righteous anger had spread like wildfire across X, Instagram, and every major news outlet in the country. By 8 a.m., Justice for James was the top trending hashtag nationwide, with millions of views and thousands of posts dissecting the incident. The KTLA live broadcast had been picked up by CNN, MSNBC, and even international networks, turning a late-night traffic stop into a global conversation about justice, power, and accountability. James Carter, the head of LAPD Internal Affairs, was no longer just a man in a suit. He was a symbol, a spark, a name that carried the weight of a movement. Inside the Los Angeles Police Department's headquarters, the fallout was immediate and severe. Officer Michael Daniels was suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs. Ironically, the very department James led. The Compton complaint from 2023, which James had referenced during the stop, was reopened, its details splashed across news reports and social media. The young man from that case, now 21 and working as a mechanic, gave an emotional interview to a local station, his voice trembling as he recounted the night Daniels had left him bloodied and broken. "I thought nobody cared," he said, tears in his eyes. "But seeing what happened last night, seeing that man stand up, it gives me hope." The public's outrage was unrelenting. with petitions circulating online demanding Danielle's badge be stripped permanently. The other officers at the scene faced scrutiny too, their inaction under review, their names dragged into the growing storm of accountability. James, however, wasn't basking in the spotlight. He'd returned home after the confrontation, the adrenaline of the night giving way to a quiet resolve. Sleep had been fleeting, his mind replaying every moment, the flashlight in his eyes, the crowd's cheers, the crack in Danielle's voice. He'd checked his phone at dawn, stunned to see his name trending, his face on every news channel, his words quoted in articles from the New York Times to The Guardian. But for James, this wasn't about fame. It was about truth, about the fight he'd been waging his entire career. He showered, put on a fresh suit, charcoal crisp, a silent armor, and prepared for what came next. The world was watching, and he wasn't about to let them down. At noon, James stood at a podium outside City Hall, flanked by community leaders, activists, and the woman from the freeway crowd who'd live-streamed the confrontation. Her name was Aisha Brooks, a 22-year-old barista and aspiring journalist who'd turned her phone into a weapon of truth. The crowd before them was massive, hundreds of people, from local residents to national organizers, holding signs that read "Justice for James" and "No More Silence." News vans lined the street, their cameras trained on James as he adjusted the microphone, his expression calm but resolute. The sun beat down, but the energy in the air was electric, a collective demand for change that pulsed through every raised fist and shouted slogan. "I didn't ask for this fight," James began, his voice steady, carrying over the crowd like a preacher's sermon. "I was just trying to get home, same as any of you. But when Officer Daniels pulled me over without cause, when he demanded to search my car without a warrant, when he treated me like a suspect instead of a citizen, I knew I couldn't stay silent. Not for me, not for you. Not for the countless others who faced the same injustice." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a tidal wave of support. Aisha, standing to his left, nodded fiercely, her phone still in hand, live streaming to her now 100,000 followers. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the fire in James's eyes. The quiet strength that made him more than a manha was a movement. "This isn't about one traffic stop," James continued, his words measured but powerful. "This is about a system that lets officers like Daniels think they're above the law. It's about a culture that looks the other way when power is abused. I've spent 10 years in internal affairs reviewing cases, holding officers accountable, and I can tell you the problem isn't just one bad cop." James raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "But we're not powerless," he said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "Last night, you, the people who stopped, who recorded, who refused to look away, you showed the world what accountability looks like. You showed that the truth can't be buried when we stand together. Justice isn't a privilege. It's a right, and we're here to claim it." The crowd exploded, their cheers deafening, their phones flashing as they captured every word. The news cameras panned across the sea of faces, Black, Latino, Asian, white, young, old, a city united by a single moment on a freeway. The press conference became a turning point, a spark that ignited conversations across the country. In Los Angeles, the mayor issued a statement promising a review of LAPD policies, with a focus on racial profiling and use of force training. Community organizations launched Know Your Rights workshops, using James's encounter as a case study. The young woman from the crowd, Aisha, was invited to speak on CNN, her live stream credited with turning the tide. "I just did what felt right," she said, her voice trembling with pride. "James was standing up for all of us, and we had to stand with him." Her words resonated, shared millions of times on X, where users posted their own stories of unjust stops, their own fights for justice. Nationwide, the impact was seismic. In New York, activists rallied outside NYPD headquarters, chanting James's name. In Chicago, a coalition of community groups demanded body camera reforms, citing his story as evidence of what happens when the public holds power accountable. On MSNBC, a panel of legal experts dissected the Fourth Amendment implications of the stop, praising James's knowledge and composure. "This man didn't just know his rights," one analyst said. "He weaponized them, and he did it without raising his voice." The clip went viral, shared by celebrities and politicians alike, from a Grammy-winning rapper to a senator calling for federal oversight of police practices. The story reached beyond the U.S., with international outlets covering the incident as a case study in systemic racism and resistance. A BBC reporter noted, James Carter's stand is a reminder that change often starts with one person refusing to back down. In London, Paris, and beyond, activists shared his story, drawing parallels to their own fights against institutional bias. The hashtag Justice for James became a global rallying cry, a symbol of what was possible when courage met opportunity. For James, the aftermath was both humbling and overwhelming. He returned to his office at Internal Affairs, where his team greeted him with a mix of awe and respect. "You're a legend, boss," one investigator said, half joking, but the weight of the moment was clear. The Daniels case was now a priority, with James overseeing the investigation personally. Evidence from the night, his phone recording, the crowd's videos, the news footage was compiled into a damning file. Daniels faced charges of racial profiling and civil rights violations, with a disciplinary hearing scheduled within weeks. The other officers were placed on administrative leave, their roles in the incident under scrutiny. But James knew the fight was bigger than one case. He spent the following days meeting with community leaders, attending forums and speaking at rallies. At one event, held in a South LA community center, he listened as residents shared their own stories, mothers who'd lost sons to police violence, young men who'd been profiled, elders who'd seen the same patterns for decades. Their voices fueled him, reminding him why he'd chosen this path. "I'm not a hero," he told them, his voice soft but firm. "I'm just someone who refused to let the truth die. You're the ones who make change happen by showing up, by speaking out, by not letting them forget." The societal impact rippled outward. Police departments across the U.S. faced renewed pressure to reform, with cities like Seattle and Atlanta announcing audits of their traffic stop protocols. Body camera policies were revisited, with advocates citing James's recording as proof of their necessity. The LAPD, under fire, implemented mandatory de-escalation training, though skeptics noted it was long overdue. Grassroots organizations saw a surge in donations and volunteers, inspired by James's story, to join the fight. A national coalition launched a campaign called Carter's Call, urging citizens to record police interactions and know their rights. James's personal life shifted too. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from old friends, former colleagues, even strangers thanking him for his courage. His sister, a teacher in Oakland, called him in tears. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'm scared for you too. You're out there now, James. Be careful." He understood her fear. The spotlight brought risks: retaliation from officers who saw him as a traitor, threats from those who hated what he stood for. But James wasn't afraid. He'd faced worse than threats, worse than flashlights in his eyes. He'd faced a system that tried to break him, and he was still standing. As the days turned to weeks, James's story became a touchstone, a narrative that refused to fade. Documentaries were pitched, op-eds written, podcasts dedicated to dissecting the incident. A mural appeared in South LA depicting James in his suit, his face calm but resolute, with the words "Truth is Power" painted beneath. For James, it was surreal, humbling, a reminder of the responsibility he now carried. He didn't want to be a symbol, but he accepted it, knowing it wasn't about him, it was about the people, the fight, the future. The final image of the story lingered. James standing at the podium, the crowd roaring, the city behind him alive with possibility. He'd turned a moment of injustice into a movement, not by shouting but by standing firm, by knowing his rights, by refusing to be silenced. The night on the 405 had changed everything, not just for him, not just for Daniels, but for a city, a country, a world that was finally listening. Justice wasn't a destination, James knew. It was a road, and he was walking it one step at a time. Alright folks, let's take a step back from the drama on Interstate 405 and talk about what James Carter's story means for yousies. You scrolling through your phone in 2025, probably sipping an overpriced oat milk latte or dodging notifications from your boss. That night on the freeway wasn't just a showdown between a man and a badge. It was a masterclass in standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. James didn't just outsmart Officer Daniel, she outsmarted a system that thrives on silence. And let's be real. In a world where algorithms decide what we see and X posts can spark revolutions, we've all got a little James Carter in us, waiting to hit record and call out the nonsense. Think about it. We're living in a time when everyone's got a camera in their pocket and a platform to speak. That crowd on the 405? They're you and me, the ones who stop, who film, who refuse to let the truth get buried under red and blue lights. But here's the kicker. It's not just about catching bad cops on camera. It's about knowing your rights, keeping your cool, and standing firm when someone tries to push you down. James wasn't swinging fists or shouting. Mamesh was armed with knowledge, composure, and a phone that said, "Smile, you're on candid camera." So what's the lesson? Power isn't just a badge or a gun. It's the truth in your hands and the courage to use it. Now let's get real for a second. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, but felt too small to speak up? Maybe it wasn't a cop pulling you over, maybe it was a boss cutting corners, a friend crossing a line, or a system that just keeps kicking the underdog. What did you do? Did you stay quiet? Or did you channel your inner James Carter and say, "Not today"? We've all got those moments, and in 2025, with the world moving faster than a TikTok trend, standing up is more important than ever. So here's my question for you. What's one thing you've seen that needs calling out? And how are you going to use your voice or your finito make it right? Drop it in the comments because I know you've got stories and I'm all ears, or rather all text. Oh, and before you go back to doom scrolling or arguing with your cousin on X, do me a solid, hit that subscribe button. We're dropping more stories like this, where everyday heroes take on the system and remind us what justice looks like. Don't miss out, because trust me, you don't want to be the one saying, "Wait, what happened on the 405? Let's keep the conversation going, and let's keep the truth alive." Who's with me?